So firstly, apologies for the change to the eating schedule. The food arrived and people started eating it. And it would have seemed unfair to wrestle with plates with people's hands. So what we've done is thought on our feet quickly and slightly amended things. And rather than change the times of all the parallel sessions, which we thought would probably be far too complicated at this late stage, you now have the luxury of 45 minutes of before networking time, or we could extend the keynote if the discussion is going on. But the parallel session span 5 and start at 2 as usually advertised. So the next keynote is from Dr. Sarah Bragg, who is currently Senior Research Fellow in the Education Research Centre at the University of Brighton. She doesn't remember, but I first met Sarah at a teacher researcher event at the English and Media Centre in Islington in London many years ago, where she was talking about her research as teaching horror in media studies curriculum in England, which I think was either during or after the PhD. Started. And what informed that discussion, I think has been a real feature of Sarah's work since, is her casting a rigorous critical gaze on what she describes as young people's relationships with popular culture, and particularly, and pertinent to this event, are questions of voice and citizenship that are constructed on whose terms in research in particular, also pedagogy. To get into these complex and charged areas, she works reflexively and collaboratively with students as co-researchers. Her work spans media education and creative arts, which is completed research projects for a number of bodies, including Creative Partnerships, the major UK Research Councils, and Office of the Children's Commission. She's published a body of important work in journals, including in our own journal Merge, chapters in edited collections, and a number of her own books. And to name 2, I personally recommend for this audience, although that's laden with assumptions I know, her 2013 article with David Buckingham on debates over sexualised childhood and feminist media studies, and her more recent co-edited collection, Youth Cultures in the Age of Global Media. Sarah Bragg.
I must admit that one of my anxieties about receiving an invitation from a Centre for Excellence in Media Practice was that my days of involvement in anything resembling media practice are far behind me, and I fear they are far from excellent even now. So in relation to current media education approaches, I'm very much the learner here, which is what's made the last year and a half particularly fascinating. Am I too loud? It feels very echoey to me now. Anyway, having admitted that, nonetheless, I am going to start with my own not excellent teaching practice as a springboard for explaining how I've thought about youth voice, participation and pedagogy over the years since. Now, I began teaching media studies in the early 90s in the post-16 sector, full of optimism, and of the kind that I still detect even now when I hear media education, media literacy described as a movement, or hear that it's going to change the world. I was influenced by writers who depicted it as a life and death matter, a tantalising combination of activism and intellect along with a captive audience. Media education was going to be relevant to young people's lives, it was going to provide pleasures that traditional school subjects lacked. In the early 90s, I think my vocabulary was rather different. So I talked more in terms of sexism and racism, for example, whereas now I hear more about sexualisation. But I think the underlying message was the same, putting it maybe broadly or oversimplistically. The media have something to do with bad things, injustices happening in the world. What the teacher does will enable young people to recognise, therefore challenge or take action against these injustices, thus media education will achieve a better world. So this was a weighty task indeed, offering a glittering image of power whilst denying that I would actually have to exercise it. It was claimed that teachers could remain merely senior colleagues and collaborators with their students, even as they liberated them from their uncritical consumption of insidious meanings and values. But classroom realities, as many others have found, were somewhat removed. Students were bored, they resented the low grades I gave them as a dogmatic dismissal of their perspectives, but I felt I had no alternative within the educational understandings available to me. Students who argued that, for instance, the images of women just reflected their innate and natural differences from men had to be marked down for failing to realise the constructive nature of representations. In particular, studying the news seemed to be my moral duty, equipping students to participate as citizens in the world around them. Now, the miners' strike of 1984-5, for example, was a defining moment in UK industrial relations, and it seemed an ideal opportunity to discuss covert media bias and how it was generated from institutional arrangements, such as the reliance on official sources like the police, the placement of cameras from within and therefore on the side of the police, ranks, partisan vocabularies and procedures that highlighted the effects of the strike on the public, rather than its legitimate causes, and so on. There's some images from the miners' strike. Students remained pretty unmoved. One student even gave up the course as a result. But in his very last lesson, he handed in the essay, I said. In it, he noticed that media coverage of the strike was in fact fair, unbiased and accurate. That the police and the government were right to do what they did because the striking miners were animals, scum who deserved everything they got. In the essay, the words are still sealed into my memory. And his views may actually be more shocking now, because now we live in a period that is after the award-winning artist Jeremy Deller's historical reconstruction of the Battle of Albury, the film Pride and the musical Billy Elliot, which have reconstructed that historical moment and our memory of it, as one where, as it turns out, we were all on the side of the miners all along. Anyway, fast forward a couple of years, and I started teaching an optional extracurricular course on horror films, as Julian mentioned, armed only with a copy of Harold Clover's Men, Women and Chainsaws and a vague desire to do something feminist around masculinity. I was taken aback by its success. The atmosphere was chaotic as 30 or 40 students, mainly heavy metal fans in leather jackets, crowded into the classroom, scribbled satanic slogans on the whiteboards, drowned out my attempts to speak and ignored my calls for calm. But at least I felt I was finally connecting to students in a meaningful way. Even my lack of control actually felt like a welcome change from the authoritarianism I was modelling in other classes. So it seemed an ideal opportunity to enable students to reflect on their informal media experiences, but actually to take horror seriously as an object of study would betray pleasures of its illegitimacy, its opposition to the elite academic ethos of the college. Students therefore consistently refused my attempts to impose formal teaching strategies in which I spoke to them as a teacher rather than a fellow fan. And I was so focused on text that I never thought then of discussing the meaning of the course itself, or the links between horror and heavy metal. Anyway, such challenges were highlighted by their responses to an evaluation form I issued at the end of the first term. And I think you'll recognise the genre here. It's an early, clumsy example of, positioning students as consumers of an educational product. What were your expectations when you chose this option? What's been the least enjoyable part? What could be done to improve this course? And the answers I got were these. See lots of blood, people being maimed and screaming in agony as they die painfully. To see dead people, people getting killed, people getting hurt, shot, stabbed, eaten, crucified, raped, shagged. Least enjoyable, the bit where Sarah goes on before the film, blathering on with her personal opinion, which is always along the lines of sex. What could be done to improve it? More tits, more gore, more internal organs up the wall. Okay, so how to respond? Well, haphazardly rather than strategically. At the start of the next term's course, I initiated the discussion discussion of moral panics about horror audiences, and as part of that, I read them out straight-faced. The students, a mixture of previous and first-time attenders, reacted with roars of laughter, but also with a kind of disowning embarrassment. Several asked if they had written particular statements, seeming both eager to find out and surprised at the same time. So it felt like a moment of breakthrough, but since it was the first time they'd ever been curious about anything I'd said, but I really lacked a means to situate and develop it. So much of my research has been an ongoing dialogue with and about those experiences of encounter and difference, as I see it in the classroom. As I wrote back in 2001, the real test of student voice is whether we can keep listening to and learn from the voices we don't want to hear when they say things that are obnoxious, objectionable, upsetting, and even apparently incomprehensible. But at this point in time, I want to highlight the connections between these examples, but more specifically how I'm analysing them, and what's being described as a post-empirical moment in contemporary research, and to argue that we need a post-empirical moment in pedagogy too. Now, post-empirical can be understood in a number of ways in terms of research. In the social sciences, there's an emerging trend of revisiting research projects from previous decades. The questions that seem so self-evidently important in one era, in another seem peculiar or short-sighted, thus illuminating our present contrast. As John Law has said, methods don't just describe social realities, but are also involved in creating them. Therefore, we need to think about the realities we want to create. And that's part of a challenge to the legitimacy of long-established social science research methods as the only way to render issues and groups visible. Not treating data as transparent insight into the content of people's heads, which was related to going beyond the transparency of experience or the adequacy of language to capture and convey experiences unproblematically. Reflexivity accompanied by about how methods and theory shape our findings, and a more object-focused understanding of the assembling of the social world. A slogan is no a priori, no assumptions about what is real, what is true, and even about what or who has agency. And these points should apply to pedagogy too, I think. I wonder if we tend to accumulate accounts of individual projects more than we think critically across and about the ones we have. Media texts don't come loaded with pre-existing meanings that we simply hold up for scrutiny in the classroom. We can't just import life experiences from outside, because what those meanings and experiences are is, in important ways, being recreated in the far from neutral context of the classroom. I initially thought that my horror course captured an already existing horror fan culture out there. But the following year, the course was timetabled later in the day and in a remote teaching hub, and attendance dried up. So the first course itself, in other words, was the occasion for constructing horror fandom and its meanings in a particular time and place, and through infrastructures of curriculum organisation and school design. But I missed all that by focusing on the first. Next, I think we fall prey to hubris, I think, if we're too ready to believe those who tell us how enlightened they've been by our teaching. But also I would have despaired if I thought my students were revealing what they really thought about me, about women, or even the minors. But they weren't. They demonstrated a mocking, almost poetic awareness of the impact of flaunting taboos, introducing violence and perversity into classroom discourse. They were engaging in a contextualised dialogue, produced for a specific purpose, and marked by an astute awareness of the language games of the classroom and of myself as interlocutor, and as I consoled myself much later, what I had impact in trying to convey. Next, historical memory doesn't depend only on experience, as I mentioned in relation to the miners' strike. Fantasy genres like horror interest me because they make no truth claims, and their relation to personal experience is indirect and problematic politically. They thus stand in for a highlight the inadequacies of all realist epistemologies, forcing us to start from a different place. We need to go beyond the assumption in much writing about youth voice that youth have some kind of privileged or unique knowledge distinct from adults. Their ways of knowing it is shaped by the other discourses that are around. They're not devoid of influence from the adult world. And I know admittedly for some of us here, the idea that youth is a social construction is just a truism. But I'm not sure that even then we're very good at absorbing the consequences of that view and taking into account that what we access depends on our research and our teaching techniques. So there's no a priori in relation to thinking that youth voice pre-exists processes or that it can act alone. And I'll explore that a bit more later. But also what I was able to see in my data depended on what others offered me. So much later I wrote Elizabeth Ellsworth's argument for pedagogies that reflect back a difference that makes a difference, which resonated with that moment. For once I hadn't required my students to be like me, to adopt a feminist or teacherly voice, but I'd taken and repeated their own words in a woman's voice. That denaturalising them this way opened the gap between the selves who produced them and who listened to them, but didn't necessarily recognise themselves within them. In the process, I thought, they might have been able to reflect on their own performance of masculinity, its functions in particular contexts, even take responsibility for it to a certain extent, and more effectively through laughter than antagonism. Even later, I read Rancière's The Ignorant Schoolmaster and was stimulated yet again to think about the positions from which learning and teaching become possible. My dependence on others to help me think has left me with a lasting distrust of the normative value of autonomy that underlies so much pedagogic discourse and critical academic analysis of education. Learning is always about indebtedness. I increasingly realise that I have something else in common with my horror fan students. I see myself too as a fan of academics. Therefore, this talk is conceived as something of a tribute act. I want to talk about some of the writers who've enabled me to see and think about issues differently in the hope that it might resonate for you too. I like to see myself as thinking with theory, as Jackson and Maxey had it. I fear maybe it's a kind of middle of the road medley, a kind of, that's what I call theory of 2015. I mentioned Ellsworth, and I've continued to find resonant her use of the concept of modal address from film and media theory. She uses it as a provocative and productive tool that asks, who does this pedagogy, like any media text, think students are? Who does it want them to be? And what ways of reading the world is it construct for them? How do all curricula invite their users to take up particular positions within relations of knowledge, power and desire? This helps us take us beyond the cognitive to think about the role of unconscious desire in teacher-student relationships and identity or subjectivity. Who do we become? What's the teacher's dream of love, as Sharon Tolley calls it? What do we want from our students? And if we want for them the enlightenment or experiences we ourselves have, could that in fact be perverse, a way of knowing in advance before the encounter who students are and what's good for them, as I did, in wanting my horror fans to take on board the insights of feminist film criticism, which would mean that we never do encounter difference. And could more open-ended modes of address, in fact, involve new relationships to knowledge, to others, to oneself, differences that make a difference? Another way of putting this is, does our mode of address in the classroom threaten students with what they lack, or invite them to become something more, something new and other? This distinction, in fact, comes from Rachel Bowlby's book, Shopping with Freud, and I don't have time here to explain fully why I found it helpful to understand voice of participation through humanities scholarship on consumption, marketing and identity. I know it seems a lot less virtuous than the lens of empowerment and democracy, but its value is precisely that it disrupts any easy opposition between passive consumption and active citizenship. The issue is not so much content, what we ask students to speak about, as who we ask them to speak as, which requires sensitivity to who they feel they're speaking to. Young people may well respond positively, I think, to any mode of address that allows them to do something more or other than dutiful students, that opens up alternative speaking positions and thus the unexpected. We need to be aware of the possible foreclosure involved if we ask students to speak as citizens, or even as audiences and members of broader social categories, as men, as women, as black or white, as LGBTQ, etc. Because the right or capacity to speak in any of these ways is the product of historical struggle. It has its own implicit rules in the classroom. It's not necessarily within the teacher's right to grant. Now, here's a small example from my research about how I think mode of address can open up possibilities. The context was a predominantly white working class school outside London, and the task was to research audiences for horror films. And for reasons I'll explain in a minute, I'll refer to this technique as problematization of media consumption. A group of teenage boys reported that they had questioned some 50 commuters outside a local train station. Alex wrote it up thus. We then done horror surveys on the street to find out what people thought about horror. This also gave us ideas of what most of the audiences liked about horror and what I could do to meet their satisfaction. I don't know if you have to be British to pick up on the voice and tone here, but it's that of a service orientation in which he depicts himself as learning to give the consumer what they want, possibly emulating the practices of the sector he aspires to work in. He's not adopting a critical academic persona of one who analyses and reflects. He's not becoming a critical citizen, exactly. But the pedagogy, the practices it allows, being outside on the street, approaching adults as equal. I think I've invited him to become something more, and this might be crucial to his pleasures and motivations. Ethically, we may have to allow students to work with what they have and who they are and want to be, even when that's not who we wish they were. Additionally, the concept of mode of address, in part because of the influence of psychoanalysis on film theory, insists that it misfires. We're not completely who we're addressed as being. And it was obvious from my questionnaire, addressing the students as education consumers was not who they thought they were or wanted to be. So they did not answer from the place to which they were called. But then again, it turned out that nor were they themselves they thought they were in responding as they did. Thus, this opens the possibility of considering the inevitability of failures and misunderstandings in education. Tamara Bibby is an academic who shares my interest in the insights psychoanalysis might offer to learning. In a recent article, she argues that learning can only flow from thinking, and therefore the toleration of thoughts that niggle. Her suggestion that the unconscious and dreaming and daydreaming might be as important to learning as intentionality and wakefulness, and that neither can prevail all the time, is difficult for education which would take control of and have mastery over intention, desire, thoughts, thinking and learning. She allows us to valorise inattentiveness, and in education this is getting increasingly difficult. A proxy for successful teaching and learning is often on-taskness, so-called, not daydreamingness. So, in dwelling on my uncomfortable memories, I aim to embody the argument that thoughts and memories that niggle are those that provoke learning and thinking, that affects and emotions produce thinking, not the other way around. But then we have to acknowledge more clearly how, when we act on the basis of our feelings, our meanings escape our control. I know, so I know it can be difficult to talk about learning in terms of failure when we're all involved also in justifying media literacy. It's very resistant, but anyway. However, my interest in psychoanalysis has long sat, perhaps uneasily, with an interest in the analysis of schooling provided by Ian Hunter in his books Culture and Government and Rethinking the School. Roy Goddard described his work in 2009 as shamefully disregarded in an excellent article on the subject that was itself shamefully disregarded. And I wonder who here, apart from Julian, has read it. Now, admittedly, it is really difficult to read, not least for its pervasive tone of lip-curling disdain for ethic and human theory. But it offers a novel, disturbing and even shocking account of English, the humanities, critical pedagogy and media education, which should really stimulate and challenge our thinking and practice, I think. Especially because it highlights how, when we insist on the democratic and progressive origins of voice and media education initiatives, we are telling only partial stories. Now you might think, as I always did, that the strategy of starting where the children are at began sometime in the progressive 1970s. Not so. Hunter, by telling the story of the school not via critical intellectuals, especially not someone as deluded as Henry Dewey, but through its reforming bureaucrats such as James K. Shuttleworth and Scottish educationalist David Stone, argues that it started in the 1830s, where Stone was already insisting that teaching should give up formality and situate itself in the playground, the principal scene of the real life of children. Hunter describes the school as engaged in the moral shaping of the citizenry required by modern nation states. We should not sneer at this or condemn it as instrumentalism. States have a right and duty to develop self-governing citizens, he says. And the modern state is not a betrayal of higher principles, but an achievement, providing in the 19th century a concept of public good beyond religious nationalism that helped, for instance, to put an end to civil wars. And actually that sounds very relevant to world politics today. So rather than having singular function or overriding intention, whether to oppress or empower, Hunter describes the school as a patchwork of pastoral bureaucracy, borrowing techniques from elsewhere in tactical improvisations. Particularly relevant for us, it borrowed from Christian pastoral guidance the technique of moral training through self-examination, introspection and conscience-forming supervision by another. So he draws direct connection between the confessional and English or critical pedagogy. Both involve problematization. The objects of that problematization vary within limits, but the pedagogical relation remains constant. And I think we can see that that relation continues today. So all the quotations on the screen suggest a pedagogical relationship in which students lack some crucial aspects of competence, even if they're acknowledged as experts in another, and they're encouraged to open up and be themselves, to share their life experiences and feelings, and to reflect on them under the supervision of a teacher, even where that teacher is acknowledged to be less expert in some respects than the student. And I deliberately took all of these out of an article by Julian, because I think they kind of reflect very well how this has remained a bit of a constant over the years, you know. Students exploring their emotional investments on their own terms, understanding their own activity, making connections, building from what students bring, bridging the gap between home and school, reflecting, crossing the boundary, reflecting on experience, etc. So in our media education or any humanities practices, we may be continuing a supervisory pedagogic relation that originated in the church confessional. Now this might feel somewhat uncomfortable, although it might also help explain the evangelism with which media literacy is sometimes approached. But equally crucially, Hunter is emphatic that we should not be dismayed by it, because although it is inevitably an exercise of power, it's a productive one. He says that teachers are not repressing their students' inner capacities. They're forming and augmenting such capacities by requiring their cultivation. So his perspective challenges the liberal notion of empowerment as handing over power to less powerful groups, or as a removal of previously oppressive power relations. Instead, it enables us to understand how power works by producing practices for acting on the self by the self, stressing the dimension of self-subjectification in any educative process. So it is a normative intervention, but problematization is not therefore inherently problematic. And I think it's helpful, somewhat unwelcome maybe, because it enables us to consider exactly what specific sets of social norms and practical competencies So thus my concern has been to refine Hunter's own position, departing from his argument that we need to develop not more fundamental principles, but a clearer view of the messy reality. To me, this is insight into the differences that make a difference connecting with our work. We work within the realities created by our pedagogical tools, the worksheet, group discussion, and plenary, evaluation, and media making. And some of these I think are less problematic than others. Alex doing the street survey is more generative, I think, than asking him to speak as a man about what his consumption of horror reveals about him. So, what kind of insights might Hunter's perspective provide? Now, I wrote on this in 2007, and then I discovered a very well-developed example by Jessica Pickett and colleagues on fair trade education, which I really recommend. But I think it really helped me to develop my analysis of youth voice further, to identify more clearly how student voice practices can be seen as problematizing teaching and learning practices, and as efforts to shape identifications, behaviour, and types of citizen, student, and teacher subjects. It made me aware of the need for a more nuanced and multi-level approach. Now, I made a resolution, I hope I can stick to it, never to talk about different voice projects as if they all refer to the same homogeneous, abstract, underlying entity, nor without mapping their location in fields of practice and funding, the various interests and tactical improvisations they involve, and the responses they receive. You know, doing this means there can be no single truths, meanings, or effects, but instead a plurality of ethical concordance amongst the multiple and various subjects involved, to include not just students and teachers, which is often what we focus on, but also administrators, policymakers, and increasingly NGOs and corporate interests. Now, this kind of analysis displaces students as the locus of agency, and in fact even as empirical entities, and indeed the individual generally fades from view, but it enables us to look more thickly at practices as units of analysis. And I'd also recommend Elizabeth Shove and colleagues' work on social practices. She tries to offer quite a user-friendly version of what practice theory involves, and she talks about practices as mobilising materials or devices, meanings and competencies. So it makes more sense in this view not to look at what exceptional individual young people or teachers are doing, but to look at how practices recruit individuals as carriers and how people defect from those practices, to understand how they change, and to focus very much on what happens in situ, in the everyday, not kind of reading off just from policy or from the conscious intentions of those involved, and becoming more aware of the layers of complexity this might add to the process, the derailment between those layers maybe. So here's an example from mine, this to sort of try and convey what this might mean. I did a project on creative partnerships and youth voice. Now, Creative Partnerships was the flagship creative learning programme of New Labour, and worked mainly in deprived areas and schools. So in other words, it's just one organisation for whom, you know, Youth Voice was only one aspect of what it did. And interestingly, its main funding came not from the Department for Education, although there was a whole agenda of schools improvement and so on, but mostly from the Department of Culture, Media and Sports. The significance of that being that it was caught up in discourses of urban regeneration through the creative industries. It also then had and in some ways what Creative Partnerships did was to sort of use Youth Voice as a kind of branding for itself, to stand out from the crowd in this sort of marketised system of a lot of people offering solutions to problems of school. And it had 38 sort of semi-autonomous regional offices, which all had a diverse leadership. And they didn't tell schools what to do, they were governing them by the structure of their application and evaluation forms that guided schools to the kind of values and things that they were trying to promote. Then they worked with artists who might come from really diverse backgrounds, from their sort of long tradition in the UK of community arts projects, or some might come from more from the corporate sector and see young people as clients. You know, in schools, heads might have very different motivations for getting involved with a creative partnership. They might just need the money. You know, they might share the vision. They might want to keep a good staff. They might want to send messages to middle-class parents that, you know, what their children might get if they came to their school. They might want to tell new stories about the school, but, you know, rapid turnover due to a marketised system where these schools were always struggling and failing because of their deprived communities often meant that it was hard for initiatives to stick. You know, teachers also had diverse motives. Students might buy in for different reasons. Some were quite, you know, cynical about needing something for their CVs. Some were concerned, invested into the strategies of differentiation from devalued, you know, working class others within the school. Some were very committed. You know, and then of course, you know, whatever happened in the name of youth voice, we've got different responses. And what we could also see sometimes, for example, was at any of those levels, you could sometimes identify deficit discourses about the kind of failure and lack of deprived communities, which also affected the kind of voice projects that happened. So no single truths there, but I think you could still point to avenues that worked a bit better than others. You know, so it seemed to us that, you know, more whole school, non-selective initiatives that didn't have a rhetoric of meritocracy, i.e. you're in this youth voice group because you're really good. If they were more about involving the whole school in these things, for me, I thought those worked somewhat better. So think about this in relation to media literacy. I mean, here's a list of the organisations that come up on a search. If you just type media literacy, not media education, media studies in, you can see how incredibly diverse they are. They're international, all around the world, different forms, blogs, books, curricula, YouTube, online teaching resources, aimed at schools, aimed at teachers, aimed at parents. You know, we could analyse each of these with a similar attention to their complexity, and indeed, I think we should. Okay, so this brings me on next. To think about the metaphors for understanding the position of children and youth in such approaches. Because I've got limited time, really, I hope these metaphors might be generative enough in the absence of being able to articulate at length the philosophical bases of these different approaches and help us get into a different space. So the first is inhabiting, and it comes from Sarah de Balaban's work. It's not media specific, but I think her metaphor of childhoods as entities that are inhabited and live within rather than something children unproblematically are is really powerful, and it's a beautifully written ethnography of the changing lives of street children in India as they're newly defined in international reforming efforts and discourses as agentic and rights-based, but in ways that, as she shows, actually obscure or deny their existing strategies for survival. So if you think child rights and universal education are self-evidently good, I really recommend you read it. Liam Berryman uses the concept of activation, that he's exploring arguments that Web 2 technologies mean that audiences are now more active, more participatory. His research explores the activation or enrolling of children as active media consumers within the design and production process of children's virtual worlds. And he does that by going to interview the staff at Habbo Hotel in Finland. And so he shows how children are kind of designed into virtual worlds and addressed and positioned as active, with designers positioning themselves as activators of children's agency. But that activity doesn't pre-exist. It's accomplished through design features. And as he shows, it is as well in practice quite an uneven and asymmetric and limited process. And in my conclusion to a recent edited collection, I use metaphors of enacting and assembling and youthing, which are actually much uglier than the other two. But YouthInc takes up a suggestion by Steve Woolgar that we should treat these reified, revered and standardised ideas like child or youth or voice, we should treat them as gerunds in order to convert them into objects of analysis. So we study youthing or voicing as processes of making, not assuming they already exist. So embedded in what I'm trying to argue are what David Oswald has described as different paradigms in childhood studies. One quite humanistic, child-centred, that bases itself on the metaphysics of presence and insists on child or youth as agentic reflexive and aligning experience, authenticity and voice as organised political speech. And the other he describes as something of a kind of ghost presence, looking at how agency might in fact be distributed across actor networks or assemblages. So, as to try and think about what I've been doing, I began with myself and my history, in part to illustrate my arguments about the need to revisit the past in nuanced and multi-level ways, and also my argument about staying with thoughts that niggle. But by trying to take you on a detour through what I've called the post-empirical, I tried to take you on a journey towards a different relationship to the biographical, the experiential, and to voice, particularly to more tits, more law, more internal organs up the wall, and away from some central but problematic assumptions about power, authenticity, voice and agency. Now we can, and indeed I think we must, develop analyses that don't give up on engaging with the graphic, vibrant, recalcitrant qualities of experience and voice, nor silence or bury those that are troubling to us or that do not express appropriate civic virtues. But we do need a way of talking about pedagogy that's more comfortable with uncertainty and failure, less clouded by presuppositions that we should and even can represent youth and their voices, less anxious to assert the empowerment of others. So my argument is that if we see notions of voice or experience or agency as enacted or accomplished, rather than as transparent, we might be able to explore more openly how voices are disclosed differently in different contexts and come to mean differently, and to construct new contexts to make them mean differently again. Now, the research that I've been reading recently talks about methodological avenues in terms of what might be live, inventive, generous, experimental, resourceful, uncertain, redistributed, heterogeneous, rich, multisensorial. And I want to argue that we should aim at these qualities when we think about pedagogies too, in ways that enable us to see those questions as dependent and unfinished and uncertain. But we do need, I think, to relegate or decenter voice and agency and experience to make more room instead for other analytical focuses on the mundane devices, the material, the technological as well as the sentient bodies involved, on curricular and governmental infrastructures that set what Foucault calls the conditions of possibility for who we are, who they can be. So I may have lost the optimism that media education could change the world, but for me, coming to consider more modestly the differences that might make a difference, or how things could be otherwise, actually feels itself like an optimistic basis for more and more open-ended conversations about our ways of addressing or speaking about, with and to children and young people. And on that note, I'd like to now ask you to talk to the person next to you and engage in a conversation for 5 minutes or so about what you've heard, and see if some questions come up that we can discuss. Thank you.
Hello. Gosh, that's really nice.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry? Do that. Right, welcome everyone to the final keynote of the conference. Well done for making it this far. We will hear from Professor Stephen Jukes in just a moment, and then the final thing of the day will be the outcome from the Youth Media Summit, and they've been working hard all day. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Stephen Jukes. He's Dean of the Faculty of Media and Communication at Keynote University. He's one of those colleagues that is in the enviable position of actually knowing what he's talking about in the industry. Unlike some of us, me, who trains on a 20-year-old year of BBC. So Stephen was actually head of global news at Reuters before making the transition to academia. And his research interests are about trauma and conflict and emotion, in as much as they relate to the practice of journalism. And I think that ethical concern extends into other work. He's also chair of the DART Centre, which provides support for support and guidance for journalists covering distressing news stories. So his talk today, as you can see, is about news in the digital age, and he's going to consider the implications for media literacy. So can we welcome Professor Stephen Jukes.
Can you hear me in the back? Okay? It's working. I have no heckling from the front row for me. So Julian kind of asked me some time ago if I would do this keynote, and I immediately said yes, great, I'd love to do it. And then I had a period of critical reflection on it, which lasted about 2 seconds, and I realized that this was A, the great budget, and B, I knew nothing about media literacy. So this was a slight, hurdle. I can't do an awful lot about the first. Congratulations on still being here. I hope I can entertain you for 30 minutes or so. As to the second, I've been enormously impressed by the last 2 days and what I myself have been able to learn, and in fact relieved to know that nobody else understands what media literacy is. And in fact, we're all struggling with the same definitional problems, because I have learned that there are dozens of definitions, so it depends where you come from. And also that it is genuinely a contested term in the academic world. And I think that's fine, absolutely fine. So I have taken the liberty of defining media literacy myself. In the context of news, and later on in my presentation I'll present you with my brief definition, which is used for the purposes of this. So, I mentioned him. When we started this conference yesterday, it was said that there was a 10-year anniversary, which is true. So I've been Dean of Media at Keynote University for 10 years as well. And part of what I'm going to do is reflect on 10 years worth of changes in the practice of journalism and news. But first of all, just say a few words about the Centre for Excellence in Media Practice, because I have the impression that media literacy is very much a North American concept. And it doesn't really speak to those of us who are in the UK dealing with journalism, or those of us potentially in Australia with the big networks, ABC and what have you. It's a very North American term. With the exception, perhaps, that the Centre for Excellence in Media Practice is put on the map in the UK. Now, I take no credit for that because Kent was awarded by the British government, by the Higher Education Funding Council, we got £5 million to set up Kent in 2005. And it was my predecessor who actually won that money. But I would like to say that there were 72 Centres for Excellence set up by the government in 2005. They were in everything from midwifery through to nuclear fission. Today, I think only two remain. One of them is the Centre of Excellence in Media Practice. All the others have been subsumed, lost, forgotten. And I think it's an absolute tribute to Julian, Richard, Laura, the whole team, because you've done a fantastic job. So thank you very much. I'm going to go behind here to animate this thing. I'm one of those people who usually walks around. So, but in those 10 years, I would say that we've witnessed an extraordinary upheaval in news. And I would also say that we've done that in our culture and society. So my perspective today is very much based on my understanding and observation of the practice of journalism. My argument is that it's crucial to recognise and understand current practice before you like to understand the concept of media literacy and the demands placed on us as educators. And those changes are essentially absolutely fundamental to everything we do. So I'm going to start with if you don't know it, you might need to read the first stanza. Don't often get Philip Larkin in a media literacy conference. Anyway, so I have three reasons for showing this poem, the first stanza on it. The first is that I just love Philip Larkin, and any excuse to get a Philip Larkin poem on the screen is great, right? The second one is that Larkin, in this poem, is capturing a significant change in culture and in society. It's the swinging 60s. And he doesn't locate it at one point. He locates it in a series of points. He starts off with Lady Chatterley's lover and the trial. In 1960, the British government, George Orwell talked about the men in striped trousers, took Penguin Books to court for publishing, or for wanting to publish Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, which of course included the F-word and all sorts of things which were going to corrupt the minds of the British population. And Penguin were going to sell it for 3 and 6pence, which was peanuts and meant to go to a mass market. And of course, at that time, British intellectuals would take trains to Paris and then buy copies of Henry Miller and Lawrence Durrell and other authors who today we would find totally innocent. But it was a turning point in society, and what Larkin's trying to do is to capture that turning point. And then he locates the other end of it for him, which was the first Beatles studio album. Does anyone know what it was? No, what's it? Sorry. Please make, yeah, please make, which of course speaks to the nature of the poem. But that's what it was. Well, it does. That was the whole point. That was the whole point of putting it in there. But actually, what happened in this period, I'm not giving you a social history lesson in Britain, but what happened was we had the legalization of homosexuality, we had the introduction of abortion legislation, we had the abolishment of the death penalty. It was a turning point in society. So that's my second reason for showing you Philip Larkin, because I think he says something about how we locate changes in society and how they have bookmarks, perhaps, bookends, but also they're located in the person. What does it mean for me? Me, Larkin, me. And the third reason is that there was something about Lady Chatterley's Lover and the trial. It was a time when literature broke out of the container of the novel. But I would say that today we are witnessing a parallel development in which news media is breaking out of the normative containers we associate with news. The newspaper and broadcast news bulletins. So I think there's a sort of, it helps to tell us a little bit about what's happening. So I suppose the question is, when did it begin for you? Was it it's too late. So this is one of them, Clinton Lewinsky, 1998. Michael Isikoff, Newsweek, had the scoop of his life. And the suits at Newsweek didn't let him publish it. So he published it, Matt Drudge, on the blog, which in a sense was, a bit of social media, changing, disrupting what we expect. Or was it 9/11? Those of you who've heard me talk at the Southbank seminar will know that I often use an example of this as the time when, in a sense, media changed because of its impact. It was the second tower was live on television globally, and there was a shared community of experience across the globe. And there was something very fundamental about the illustrative nature of that coverage. Or was it the Asian tsunami, Boxing Day 2004, which was when holidaymakers used their video to tell the story that nobody expected the tidal wave? Or was it this one, which was my personal, if you like, Larkin moment? It was 7/7, 2005, the London bombings. Now, I grew up in London during the IRA bombing campaign, so it spoke to me very personally. But this was when the BBC news cameras couldn't go down in the tunnels into the underground. And so mobile phone pictures were used really for the first time in mainstream news media. So for me, that was a turning point. And it was also the turning point for the BBC, because that's 10 years ago. And it was 10 years ago that the BBC set up its user-generated hub, which I'll come on to later on. But Heather Moden, who was then the head of news, talks about that very eloquently, actually. And she says, just a light bulb moment went on across the whole of the BBC, and they said, you know what, we've got to capture this stuff. Or is it these images? So, of course, this is the Boston bombing, the marathon bombing, which is very painful, I'm sure, for the city, but also, by this time, 2013, we sort of come to expect it. And it would be quite odd not to have social media to cover that story. Or this one, which was the killing of an off-duty soldier, Drummond Rigby, outside his barracks in Woolwich in southeast London. When the killer, who was convicted with another one, stopped and waited for a passerby to actually film him on a camera, on a mobile phone. There's another story attached to that, which is that ITN, which produces news for independent television news, sent a producer down there in a taxi, not that far, and he found a banker who had taken the video, rode him back in the car to 200 Grayson Road, which is the headquarters of ITN. They played his mobile phone out onto the server, and they played it out live onto the 6 o'clock news. And they told the anchor on 6 o'clock news what was happening. They hadn't actually seen those pictures. So there's one or two interesting ethical points that are raised by that. We might not want to go into them too deeply, and please don't tell ITN what I've said. But it's true. That's how it happened. Or this one, of course. And some of us in this room have written about how ISIS is a master of social media. And they're pretty good at it, obviously. So we come to expect that. So it's sort of ingrained and embedded in what we do these days. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about changes that are occurring to the practice of journalism. And my take on this is that we need to understand these changes, and if we understand these changes, we are halfway along the road to media literacy in the news context, and to know what we actually are doing when we have students in front of us. And I think you need to be able to explore and expand and explode the component parts of these changes, as actually my colleague Brad Giori did yesterday, when talking about the actual making of the news and how to do it. So I've tried my little definition here, which says that I think it is understanding how news media inform, create meaning, and we create meaning as well, obviously, engage individuals in society, sometimes to action, and our ability to critically evaluate the news. I'm not sure if that's a proper definition. It's the one I've used, and it's the way I can see it. And I put there a picture of Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, because 5 or 6 weeks ago I was lucky enough to interview Donald Graham, the now in his 70s, the last publisher of the Washington Post. And the Post had been in the Graham family, the dynasty, for 80 years. And I interviewed him in the round before students and faculty before, and he was a sad man. I thought, in the nicest possible way, he was genuinely sad about having to have sold the Washington Post. And for me, it was a very poignant moment as well, because it was the Watergate scandal when I was at university, and actually the filming of All the President's Men, which sort of inspired me to become a journalist. It's quite, I don't get too emotional about it, but it was true. And I think the whole generation, my generation, it was a key moment at Watergate. And Donald Graham, in those days, was actually a young reporter in the Washington Post newsroom, learning the trade, so he could take over from his mother, Catherine Graham. But anyway, the point of the story is that he said at the end, he said, well, you know what, I sold it to Bezos because he understands the digital world and because he has deep pockets. And that's probably about it. Understanding it, and you probably need to have deep pockets. And actually, they're taking on staff, which is quite interesting. So this is what I'm not going to talk about. This is what we know already. So we know that we're all communists, 774%. We know that we can see news anytime, anywhere. So the days when the foreign correspondent was omniscient, omnipotent, knew everything, told you what he wanted to tell you, when he wanted to tell you, have gone. We know that. We know the business model has been fundamentally disrupted. And we know what that's meant. It's meant huge cuts to news gathering across the globe. And we know that some news outlets have attempted to, come into being on the back of that. Vice is getting quite a lot of news at the moment and is quite successful, as is BuzzFeed and others. But we've also seen the erosion of trust, and we saw that very clearly with the Leveson crisis in the UK. Probably a direct relation to, or direct consequence of the collapse of the business model, where tabloid newspapers, desperate to bolster their circulations, which were falling, of course, pushed the limits of journalism beyond the legal. And so we know that. I don't really want to talk about that. I want to talk about something that I think is fundamentally, probably more subtle. I'm not sure if it is more subtle, but there are 4, if you like, trends, which mean that we no longer think of in terms of Uncle Walter, the man who sort of told the news as it is. So this is the first of those 4 trends. And I'm not sure if they're really trends or whether they're complexities or struggles which we're going through. But there's certainly things that I perceive to be happening. And the first one is what I have called on this slide, and it's not my term, I've called new visibility. And it comes into conjunction with this concept of media life, if you like. The fact that our relationship to media has changed. It's not me here and I'm interacting with media over there. It is we are media. It's this immersion in media, which I think it's fundamentally different and has come into being quite recently, in my view. And we heard this morning about how there is no hiding and you can't erase your history. We are in media. And then that's reinforced, I think, by the revelations from Assange and Snowden, who just made it absolutely clear that everything we do is embedded in media, it's tracked. There's nothing they don't know about you. Or maybe some, but no. And so that now spills over into news gathering. And we're seeing things we didn't see before. So this is one thing we see. Now, this is a very disturbing picture. You will know where it comes from. It comes from a Damascus suburb in 2013, when it looks like Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. There were 100 video images, clips of this uploaded to Western media within 1 hour of it happening. In 1988, I was a foreign correspondent for Reuters in the Middle East, and I was involved in covering Saddam Hussein's massacre of the Kurds in Halabja. One of my colleagues, I didn't go, Patrick Worsnick, who went on to work for the UN, hitched a lift with the Iranian military. This is on the border between Iran and Iraq, and obviously the Iranians were in charge there. Got there, together with the New York Times and the AP. I desked that story back in Bahrain. It took us 5 days to get that story to the world. 1988, 2013. 5 days, 1 hour. That's what I mean by visibility. I'll try this one. This is obviously very contested. MES2015 downed over Ukraine, Russia. This is apparently the missile launcher. It actually goes to the heart of the fact that one of the jobs that journalism has to do today is to verify. There's so much stuff out there, and I'll talk about verification later on. And then there's this one. One of the things that surprised me when I was watching, like I do, wall-to-wall television during the Paris siege and the shootings Friday, a week ago, was the lack of social media. In fact, as you could flick from all the channels through BBC, Sky, Fox, CNN, MSNBC, RT, Al Jazeera, Euronews, France 24, French and English. They were all using the same video feed, actually, from one French 24-hour news agency. But there was some stuff, and this was, of course, was that dramatic moment where the pregnant woman was trying to escape, and then spawned that enormous, hugely emotional story of the man who got her back and saved her. Well, I don't think we've seen that sort of stuff before. That was a mobile phone picture from somebody down below. But I would say, just put a damper on some of this. Have we seen it before? So, that's a pretty shocking picture. It's gone around the world. But some of us will remember this one, which was the Red Army, Fraktion, in 1978, which kidnapped and then killed the former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. So they were pretty good at propaganda as well. And the change for me is about intensity. It's about intensity, it's about scale, and it's about the global reach, which the Red Army didn't have. And they certainly didn't have it in real time. So this is about global connectivity and the changing relationship between the journalist and his or her subject. And it's changing fundamentally in my view. Second big change is around tone. And it's one of the great sort of contradictions or tensions of media and of news that we always talk detachment is probably one of them, which we probably all can identify with as journalists. But actually, when you think about it, we have to engage the public. We have to sell, in inverted commas, a story. And to do that, we use emotion. Jean Seaton captures that actually it's a book she wrote some time ago, 10 years ago now, but Jean Seaton is an academic, she's also the historian of the BBC. And she puts it up there quite clearly. And this here is the new newsroom in the BBC. And in the centre of that newsroom, you have the user-generated hub, what Helen Bowden set up 10 years ago. And actually, it's in the centre. And I think that tells you a story about the way it's driving news. And this is what it's about, because these UGC desks are now taking in raw footage. I think it started off with skateboarding dogs and things like that, and it's become a diet of horror and pornography. That's basically what they get. And some of this stuff is getting played out live or on a loop onto our screens. So Charlie Hebdo, the shooting of the policeman, we saw death on our screen. We don't often see that. And in fact, there's a lot of problems with that for many news organizations. But there is this tension now between that normative behavior of attachment and engagement. Now, I've been doing a lot of work as a research project on vicarious suffering of journalists, principally young journalists who are working on these user-generated hubs, where they're taking in social media all day, hands-on, watching video, nasty stuff. But what they're also doing, they're doing something else. They're making contact with all these people. So they're talking. So one of the people I spoke to, which is a producer, I won't say where she works, a major news organization, and she was in touch with Syrians, Iraqis, jihadis, call them what you like, in the north of England, but also in Syria, also in Iraq, using Skype and all sorts of messaging systems. And she said, she was talking about how she formed a virtual relationship with this person. It's very intense, actually, although it's a virtual relationship. But then one morning she'd come into the office, and he wouldn't be there anymore. And then a few days later, you'd find out he's being killed, or he's blown himself up. And so there is something very different happening here in the relationship between the journalist and the subject, which is becoming much more engaged. And this is this tone which is changing. And we're seeing a blurring of lines, and we're seeing open displays of emotion. I'm not going to run this video because when I tried it didn't really work very well. But here was a BBC reporter who was reporting about, he was actually reporting about the day after in Paris, and how the Eiffel Tower had been lit up in the red, white, and blue colours. And he broke down on screen, and that shows to me, it wasn't deliberate, obviously, but it shows to me that somehow we're generating so much emotion around these pictures that even a very, very experienced correspondent, he's been a correspondent for 20 years, it was just too much for him on screen. This is the third point I want to make, which is about, if you like, performativity, if that's the right word. It's about ritual, and I think those rituals are becoming more pronounced. So, Lily Nuyaki is an academic at the LSE in London, and she talks about how journalists today have two functions. The function we always thought we used to have, which was, let's just tell you what happened. That's the objective stuff. It's the proof. So you know that 129 people were killed in Paris. But actually, there's something else which is happening now, and that's almost an emotive testimony of the suffering. And Lily Nuyaki works a lot the suffering of distant others and things like that. But I think what she's captured here is a trend, and I see that trend in everything I observe, is that the journalist now is also expected in many broadcast environments to give an emotive testimony of what they have seen. And it could be quite subtle, and sometimes it's very overt. And so here are some examples of that. And I think we have this almost a performative space. So one of my colleagues, Gavin Rees, writes about how, as a conflict, you have this almost stage scene, a performative space in which the journalist and the subject, person being interviewed, if you like, on stage. The first picture is a small town in Germany called Haltern am See. And this was when the German Wings plane was brought down by the pilot over the Alps. And it turned out that there was a school trip from Barcelona to this German town, German village really. And I think 16 or 17 of the pupils in that school were killed, and one of the teachers. And so the media descended, pack mentality, of course, the media descended, and this is the media there. But actually what happened was something very different, because certainly on the BBC and on some of the outlets, other outlets I watch, you had German schoolgirls, perfectly made up, in pretty good English, talking to camera about what was going on. And for me, that was a performance. And there was something almost conniving, incestuous about the relationship of that performance. And I then started to think about some of the literature which has been written about reality TV, and how for some people, the reality of TV is more real than real, so to speak. And of course, sometimes it doesn't work that way. So this picture here is of an editor of a local newspaper. His name is Frank Nibkai, and he is in Winnenden, which is in Baden-Württemberg in southwest Germany. And there was a school shooting there in 2009, I think, and 16 school children were killed by former pupil who just shot up the school. Frank Nibkai said, well, we're not going to actually do this interviewing all the victims' parents and what have you. We're not going to do that. We're going to just write the story and we'll leave everybody alone. And they did that. Of course, the rest of the German media was all over it. You know, Bild Zeitung was, the tabloid there was trying to get him to give pictures. They had all the pictures of the killer as a schoolboy. And he didn't actually sell them to them. So he took this very principled stand. And then a year later, he was in the supermarket in Winnenden. He tells me, he's told me this story. And one of the parents of one of the children who was killed came up to him and said, well, what's wrong with you? Why on earth haven't you spoken to me? Why haven't you interviewed us? Because the expectation was that he would. That there was that ritual. But it was also potentially cathartic for the parents, but I mean, that's another story. But somehow our expectations today are that we do that. And he changed his policy, and he said, actually, you know what, I probably got that wrong. And this is the last of those changes I perceive. We sort of all know the unwritten rules, that's why they're unwritten. You know, any journalist in this room knows what a story is. You can read a textbook and it will tell you what a story is, but actually, you know what? I know what a story is. And I know what's not a story. It's an unwritten rule. I know how I can get my career advanced in journalism. I know how I can get my career validated through prizes. I know what my behavior should be. These are the unwritten rules, the doxa, if you like, of journalism. I think they're changing. And I think they're changing for several reasons. They're changing because the image-driven emotive content, which we're seeing, which is now dominant, and it speaks to a different bit of the brain. I think we've got these new players who are really pushing video device, for instance. We're seeing a generational shift. So these desks are being staffed by 20-somethings from J School, but some of them aren't. Some of them are hired for their linguistic ability. They're Arabists. Some of them are Arab, so they can understand the difference between the Syrian accent and an Iraqi accent where they're trying to do verification of stuff. And I think they're bringing their own rules because they're not necessarily integrated into that newsroom. So I know I said that we've got the BBC, you can see it in the middle, but actually, are they really part of that community of journalists? Or are they actually creating their own unwritten rules? And are those actually influencing the others? And then I think there is a sense by which we are concentrating now on these two things, curation and verification, as the example of the missile launcher in the Ukraine showed. So I think there's a subtle shift happening here. And I think we will see over time that those rules are being, those unwritten rules are being rewritten, if that's logical. And this is my last slide. I suppose really the question is it the end of journalism as we know it? Well, no, of course it's not. That will be very soon. I'm not saying that the tenets, the basic tenets of journalism have changed. For me, it's still about holding power to account. It's about fostering democracy. It's about shining a light in dark places. It's what journalism does. It does it brilliantly well. What I'm saying is the way it's done is different, it's changing. And then, is it a democratizing force? Is social media, is the digital world a democratizing force? Well, so yes and no, actually. I think that's a far more difficult question, and one which you could argue both ways, and probably both ways are right. So we know that elite sourcing is being diminished. Look at the Arab Spring, the first days of the Arab Spring, where many, many people from the streets were being quoted. We know that dictators can't hide anymore. But actually it's very easy to overstate that. And if you look on the other side of the coin, the algorithms which are driving news aggregators 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of news are based on commercial considerations. And they in turn are recycling back into the agenda setting. And I think you'll find that you can argue that more both ways. So really what I'm saying is I think there are those four main points. And so I'm not sure if they're trends, they're what I observe. It's about this visibility, it's about a tonal shift towards more emotion driven by image. It's about the heightened performativity, the hardening of those frames which come from that artificial performative space. And it's about how I believe the unwritten rules are in the process of changing. So I maintain that those four changes embed media more deeply in our lives. I think with it, the way news works is changing. And if we can understand those changes, it's a vital first step in considering how we can approach media literacy in the context of news journalism.
Okay, we've got 15 minutes for questions, and it's not a roving mic, it's a wide mic, so tell me and I'll tell everybody else. No, just...
Okay. Thanks for a great lecture. So my question is not only about media literacy, it's also about journalism education. And I'm struggling to understand this, but more the implication of this on teaching journalism and teaching media literacy. How do we reach a generation where we don't even know where this thing we call journalism is going? I mean, there's all these stories, like you said, about journalism, the end of journalism as we know it. What do we teach? Do we teach traditional journalism along with these new ideas? Do we focus only on these new ideas and innovation in journalism and media literacy? Or do we do a combination of both? I don't know. I think my question is very vague, but you can give us something about it.
Did anyone hear the question?
Yeah, it's a killer question. It's the one I haven't answered. And it's the one I don't know the answer to. The reason I start on this is that there are probably core values, but those core values go to the heart of why we do journalism. They're not how we do it, they're why we do it. And that is, as I said, holding power. We know all the arguments, but why would we do it? So why we start with that? And then I try to look at practice and observe practice. And I think you can teach, I think you need to teach, personally, you need to teach those core normative values, which are around detachment, impartiality, freedom from bias, and what have you. But I don't think you can teach them and just say that's it, because it's not. I think they have to be located in this, because they're not absolutes, and they're changing. But I think you've got to understand them as a starting point. So I don't know, I mean, this is probably not a discussion in that sense, but I mean, Brad, you talked about some of those things yesterday, where Brad tried to tease out the component parts of how you construct a story. And, looking at them, take detachment and say, well, let's do a detached story, let's do an undetached story and see how they come out and how they play out. So I think it's about pulling things apart and understanding that. But it requires a fairly deep understanding, and I think I'm struggling with how we start on that with first years, so to speak. I'm struggling with that. So I don't have answers, I'm sorry.
Okay, Steve next, then Chris then.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. You talk about a new generation of journalists with different attitudes and coming from different spaces, and talking about the emotive nature of UGC. There are new players, there is a generational shift. But what you didn't mention is there a new ownership? Traditional models of newspaper ownership and separation between owners and editorial, it seems to me, are breaking down. And when you talk about these things in terms of generational shift, are you actually overemphasizing the agency of these new people, these new entrants that are getting involved? And perhaps what we're actually seeing is the influence of the new corporate, new generation of corporate owners who are basically unconstrained, who are essentially pursuing sales and audience and influence.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that at all. I don't think I've heard from the people I've spoken to and the studies I've been doing. I do think that the generational influence is very strong. And I think they are having, in mainstream news organizations, where the rules are fairly clearly laid down, actually, and I'm not talking about commercially, I'm talking about non-commercial ones, perhaps like BBC, I think they are having an impact on the news agenda. And I think it's almost surreptitious, if you like. But I agree with you that I haven't spoken at all about that, and the structures of ownership are different, and they are vastly more commercial. And I think the days in which we ruled off the editorial, and actually ruled it off, and that was opinion, and this was, in inverted commas, fact or reporting, that's gone, I think, largely, unless you take, unless you look at the major, Reuters, AP, BBC, ABC, and what have you, Australian BBC, not yet. Yeah, I think, I agree with you. So I think if you look at what are the drivers for a BuzzFeed, I think you could ask some quite hard questions about that. You could ask some quite hard questions of Jeff Bezos as well. So I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So Postman had an issue with, Postman was on television, obviously, but this issue of total shift or emotion when things become picture driven. And he saw that as working in, well, at least intentionally, really in opposition to democratising thought. So how do you see that relationship? Because obviously you have that sense of, viewers have that sense that the written word was about the rational, and therefore one could debate it, but then someone moved to this very picture-driven approach that they went into the realm of fascist intention, and now what it is more or less. So how do you, because you've got those people that you've got the democratising but also the ownership. Do you see those as being intentions? Do you see that as an issue, that sort of automotive, in terms of using use as democratising?
Well, I think when I said is it a democratising force, I think it's very contested. I think you can argue both sides. And I would argue that the use of image is, per se, speaks to our emotions, is often used in propaganda, as we know. And I think that is what media literacy is about. It's about understanding the impact of image, which isn't always a democratising force. So I think I agree with you entirely. But what I see, however, is not, obviously we see images being used in propaganda or for those sort of, those processes. But we also see images increasingly used in mainstream media. So you look at the BBC on your iPhone, and 3/4 of the screen is pictures. Not a lot of text in there. So the first thing we see are pictures. And we're forming our opinions. Okay, there may be an effective reaction to that, but there's going to be a cognitive processing of that. And then I think you're actually forming your opinions on the basis of the pictures before you start to read the words, because there aren't any words there. If I'm reading the BBC on my iPhone, or The Guardian, you don't see an awful lot.
So, I teach undergraduates in journalism school, and many are not enamored with what we would consider legacy or mainstream media. What they are, what resonates for them is John Oliver and Vice. And I'm just curious what you think of both of those, John Oliver and Vice.
Shall I will repeat that one? The question is about undergraduate students not really resonating with legacy media and actually having more of an affinity with Vice and John Oliver. Is this on the Daily Show?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he has his own show now.
You mean the Daily Show of John Oliver?
He has his own show.
It is anything else. Does it really matter where people get their news from? Doesn't matter to me. I'm a journalist at heart. I've been an academic for the last 10 years. I consider myself an academic. But, it doesn't worry me where you get your news from, as long as you understand where it's coming from, so to speak. So, I think there's a interesting trend towards news through comedy, which is actually very prevalent in the UK at the moment. And it's very interesting to see comedians being used as mainstream news commentators and actually purveyors of news. And so I don't really worry about that. It comes down to media literacy for me, is understanding the way the sausage is made. If you understand the way it's made and where it's coming from, I think you have a better understanding of it. And what I always say to our students is, you actually need to have many, many different sources. And what worries me most about media today is what worries me most about the way, I hate to say this, young people, qualify that, the way people consume news is the fact that they have one or two sources and very little else. And sometimes those sources are self-confirming ones, so they're through Facebook or what have you, and self-confirming to certain friends, and it's only the news you're ever going to get because it just confirms your own prejudices, if you like. In the way we buy a newspaper in our own image. But, so it doesn't concern me at all, but I think we need to know, students need to know what their agenda is. To your point, what's the commercial agenda behind those operations? Is there a farmer war in that we would expect there to be a firewall between the commercial and the editorial in a mainstream legacy news organisation. So, yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one more from Karen, and I can see that the youth media delegation has arrived, so we'll then move into that.
Can you speak up? If the unwritten rules are changing, is the onus on us as journalists and therefore journalism educators to show our workings around that and to share with people that journalists are changing their focus around that? Because there are expectations around us, management,
Yeah.
so should we be sharing change, and there might be a greater sense of efficiency?
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, do you want to...
If journalism is changing, is it incumbent upon journalists, journalism educators, to, as Karen was it, to show their working, to make transparent the means of production?
I mean, yes, clearly, but I mean, what I would say, it's not our job to rewrite the rules. I mean, it's not our job to determine what those rules are. I mean, I think there are times when the academy can actually have an impact on policy, and that's completely different. But I mean, I think we need to understand how those rules are changing. And to do that, as an academic, you have to be embedded in the profession. And I don't think you can divorce professional practice from education. Unless you understand current professional practice, you are not going to be able to do the education. And so to me, it's about transparency and about openly discussing those changes, because they are changes.
That's great. Can we thank Stephen?
Thank you. So we just like to keep you here for about another 15, 20 minutes for some closing remarks, and then for the important finale, which is the Youth Media Education Summit outcomes. The idea, we established this tradition last year in Prague, and the idea is we talk about young people for 2 days, and then we let them in for the last minute. We let them show. So they have the last word, please. So in terms of some closing remarks, I mean, obviously a huge thank you to everybody for coming here, everybody who's presented, the keynotes, all the delegates, people filming. I'll name a few, but I'll obviously forget most of the important people, some of them at least. I'd like to thank Stephen Jukes as well personally, because he said some kind of things about Kent surviving for 10 years, but that's in no small part due to his support for Kent. Particularly in kind of re-establishing ourselves as a new version after our funding ran out, and allowing us to work in new ways, and allowing us to, or supporting us in reaching out to the international community, and you know, so it's quite a big deal to put on a conference co-hosted by somebody in another city. It needs institutional support to make that happen, so we're really grateful to Stephen for that. I'd like to thank everybody in the Kemp team, they know who they are, and the various associates at Kemp who've travelled with us. And obviously Laura Hampshire, again, for all the sterling work and stress that this entails, and Lokesh. I don't know if Lokesh is here. Lokesh lives in a kind of parallel space to the rest of us. Anyway, Lokesh will put the programme together with websites and all those things. To Paul, who I'm sure is still here somewhere. And the Emerson team, thanks to Paul. And it's been challenging, I think we both agree, but we got there in the end and it's been fantastic. I'm sorry for all the panicking, because obviously I didn't need to panic, because it worked out well. From my point of view, and I hope you'd agree, the plurality and the range and the diversity of the conference is its real strength. I've got some good lines in this bit, I think, so I'm going to read them from the notes. Whenever I do this, nobody laughs, but I enjoy it. So we've gone from research, fascinating research, collaborative research with young people in my hometown of Nottingham, in the East Midlands, from Jay McIntyre, all the way to Jad Melki on digital media literacy in Beirut, and on to Mexico City and to Niigata in Japan over the course of the 2 days. The keynotes have taken us from Dewey to Dukes. I was actually laughing to myself. This is the best bit. Via Sarah Bragg's critique of voice, and David Gauntlet's many voices expressed through the medium of postmodern ventriloquism. But what struck me the most really, and it was the same last year, has been the kind of quality of convivial argument. And I think it's not too silly to end by just saying it's been really nice. You know, we've had a really nice time, we've had some really challenging and conflicting conversation at times, but the atmosphere has been convivial, supportive, and kind of mutually respectful, so thank you all for that. So that's me done. I'm going to hand over now to Marketa and Kelsey on the youth team for the grand finale.
Alright, so I don't want to keep you too long because I know this is the end of a Saturday, a very long, fulfilling, and jam-packed summit that we've had. I just want to have the moment and appreciate your time briefly introducing some of our young scholars here who had the time today to kind of get to know each other and explore some of the topics that we've been exploring around media and education. They've had some really rich conversations around what media means to them, why digital media is important to them, and what they hope to see in schools. We then had a visit from some very kind, enthusiastic women. Are they still here with the every time before I say it, the virtual glasses, and we had a thrill with that. And then we also had a handful of attendees came for lunch and had a really meaningful conversation. And out of that, kind of did this fun, collaborative, short filming experience. And we kind of put that together quickly in the afternoon, and they're going to show you that piece. But I'm also going to let them speak a little bit about this, but that was just kind of the recap of the day. It was on Twitter too. We taught some of them and the teacher with them how to use Twitter, and we were also trying to work on documenting our process throughout the day. So hashtag MES Boston. If you look that up on Twitter, you'll see what we did all day as well. Hand it over.
Hi, I'm Valentina Hernandez, and me and TJ were from the Beacon Charter High School in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. We're really happy to be here today. We're really glad that you guys had us. The film that's about to be played isn't the best example of what we can do, but we hope you guys can get a good laugh out of it. We definitely had a lot of fun doing it, and after it's over, we're going to talk to you guys about what it meant for us to make it and the process that we went through.
So we also understand that, again, not everyone knows everything. We don't expect everyone to know everything. The one thing that we would like is a little guidance on how to get to where you want us to be. So that way, we don't so much need a controlling factor over our use of technology. We need something more of aid to get us to know the knowledge that you want us to know. So when we're having these barricades that are not allowing us to find the valid sources, we would like more freedom so that we can get those sources, because there are situations where we should not go on certain websites, but on those same websites there might be some valid points, and I think that it would help that if you guys gave us the facts of here's the situation, how we can find the information, and that gives us the freedom to find out for ourselves. definitely had fun doing it, to say that. But in the end, we all, I'm pretty sure I speak for all of us, when I say thank you for the awesome opportunity you gave us for coming here. One thing that we really did focus on was integrating both professionals in the environment of media and students who are also experiencing it. So it really just was an awesome opportunity to have you guys come here so we could both you guys and us express our opinions on the topic.
We talked about a range of different topics. So one thing we wanted to focus on was like trust between teachers and students. So we thought that one of the main barriers was the fact that like teachers didn't trust us to use social media and the internet in lessons. But what we found out was that it's actually through the idea that teachers are worried that they won't know as much as we think that they know, and that we can find stuff out for ourselves rather than them teaching us. But as teachers said in the film, it's about them aiding us rather than like controlling us.
So I just want to say thank you. We were able to use the engagement lab space, which is incredible. So thank you, Emerson College, Paul Violatis with the engagement space, Julian for bringing wonderful contributors to this event and hosting this, and also Birmingham University and Marquetta in the back, who refused to be acknowledged, and then Katie Rees and her colleague who came and also brought wonderful participants today from Rhode Island. Thank you.
Okay, that's it.
Everyone hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? No. You can't hear me, let me know.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yes, okay, I'll try to keep my voice up. If folks can't hear in the back, go like this, make some kind of sign. So thank you so much, Galina, for that kind introduction. I was talking to her a little bit before lunch, and she said she actually did a little stalking of me online to produce that, and which is just awesome. She did stop short of calling my mother, though, which I really so I just want to add one or two notes of context for the work that I do. She mentioned that I work with Howard Gardner, but I want to say something more about Project Zero, which some of you may be familiar with, and others won't. Project Zero is a research center that has been at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for almost 50 years, which is pretty incredible for a center that relies on soft money. So it was founded in 1967. And Project Zero does work, it's pretty broad in scope at this point, but if I could summarize, we look at what constitutes deep understanding, thinking, and learning in a variety of contexts: schools, museums, online contexts increasingly. The age span we tend to focus on is K through 12, or in other terms, other parts of the world might use primary and secondary. Although there is some work at Project Zero that looks beyond that, looks at adult learners, as one of my colleagues there, Prochaski, likes to say. We span from pre-K to gray, which I think is a good way of putting it. So I think that, I just wanted to put that out there because it gives you a sense of some of the focus for my work. I typically speak to K through 12 educators in different parts of the world, actually, and much of the research we do has that audience in mind when we build educational materials for educators often working with that age group. The other thing I'll say is that I've been a part of the digital media and learning network for some time, the network that really MacArthur got off the ground to look at the affordances of digital media for learning. But the work that I do, although it's so relevant to media literacies, is not framed in media literacies terms. I'm sure many of you in the audiences will see strong connections. And I do talk about skills, but I just wanted to put that out there from the get-go. Okay, so in framing my talk, I don't have a clicker, but I will come here unless someone can frame me one. I'm going to focus my talk today around a couple of through-line questions that have really occupied my attention for the last couple of years. And you know, I am using that normative word good here. And that's me to define it. So my big questions are, what does good online participation look like? What does it require? And how might we support it? So I've been addressing these questions, exploring these questions, in both research and practice on a couple of different fronts. So first the social, or what we might think of as young people's everyday exchanges, which are typically social on social media and on the internet. The second is young people's civic activities, how they're using the internet to be participants in a larger public sphere. And increasingly, this is a more recent line of work, has been looking at young people's intercultural exchanges and how we can create environments that support good intercultural exchanges. So I'm really going to focus in this talk on the second two fronts. But I'm going to share a headline or two about the first because it really does frame the way I think about this space. So young people's everyday exchanges on social media was really at the center of a project that Howard and Gardner and I led for several years called the Good Play Project. It was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And really the aim of the project was to look at how young people and the influential adults in their lives were thinking about the moral and ethical dimensions of online context and decision making. Really, at its heart is to what extent and how are young people sensitive to some of the moral and ethical dilemmas that come up because they have an opportunity to share content in network publics. And the short answer to this question was not so much. So not so much sensitivity. So what we found in interviewing young people between the ages of 10 and 25 is that they largely took very individualistic approaches to their online activities. And they displayed frequent ethical blind spots and disconnects. And so based on this work, I argue that young people need to be developing more conscientious habits of connectivity. And adults play a really important role here because in interviewing adults, the key headline we found is that their messaging, the supports they give to youth, really emphasized that sort of individualistic, self-focused, protectionist approach to the internet. So that, in a nutshell, is what we found as part of the Good Play Project and what I write about in the book Disconnected. So if I revisit the core through-line questions that I put up a few minutes ago, the Good Play work really suggested that good online participation is conscientious. It's conscientious, it's aware of how one's online postings have effects both for individuals whom one knows and a broader community, a broader network of public out there. And good online participation requires ethical thinking skills, which I talk about in Disconnected, but also the disposition to reflect on moral and ethical issues, sensitivity to dilemmas, and the motivation to grapple with them. And how might we support it? So what I argue in the book is that the weight of internet conversations needs to shift a little bit from safety and self-protection to, or at least to be more inclusive of conversations about digital ethics and citizenship. So that's the headline on that front. Those are the kinds of things and ways I've been answering these big questions based on the work that we did as part of the Good Play Project. So now I'd like to do deeper dive into how my colleagues and I have been engaging these questions around young people's civic participation, specifically looking at how young people are taking up opportunities for voice and dialogue about political issues on social media. And so we've been doing this as part of the MacArthur Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network. It's a mouthful, so I'm just going to shorten that to YPP. The YPP network is an interdisciplinary group of mainly scholars, but also practitioners who are interested in looking at the question of how digital media are changing the face of youth civic and political engagement. So the network is interdisciplinary, disciplines ranging from psychology to anthropology to media studies, political science and education. I'm probably missing a couple, are represented in there. Our methods are also interdisciplinary. At different sites, we're using survey research, we're using qualitative interviews, ethnographic case studies to explore that really important, rich question. Now, the center of the YPP network's work is this definition of participatory politics. Now, when we think about civic and political engagement, many people often think of the voting booth. They think about aspects of electoral or institutional politics, but the network, the YPP network, has taken a broader view and defines participatory politics as interactive, peer-based acts through which individuals and groups seek to exert both voice and influence over issues of public concern. So we have a couple things to really pay attention to. Peer-based is really important. One of the big things that we've been talking about is social media provide youth opportunities to do public-facing work about public issues that is not deferential to or requires an institutional gatekeeper who is an adult. You don't need to be 18 and a voting age to participate in public sphere. Many of you are familiar with this, the affordance of social media. But that's how we define participatory politics. This definition is paired with a set of participatory practices that have been long part of civic and political engagement, but we argue are given a new or more expansive edge in a way because of the digital landscape. So the opportunity to investigate about civic issues, to circulate content that has a civic or political bent, to produce content that has that content, to engage in dialogue with one's peers, both known and unknown, about important issues, and to deliver feedback to power holders, and to mobilize individuals to take action on behalf of a given cause or issue. So these core civic practices are, as I said, given an edge because of the digital landscape, and the key aim of the work of the network has really been to look at both the quantity and the quality of youth's deployment of these practices through those different methods that I mentioned. So for our part, our group at Project Zero has been conducting qualitative interviews with young people who are civic actors, so they're engaged in something that has a civic or political bent to it, between the ages of 15 and 25. And we've been specifically interested in how these young people express their civic voices on social media and what informs their voice decisions. So when we think about voice, it's most closely connected, if we think back to those practices I just mentioned, it most closely connects to the practice of dialogue and feedback, but I think it's informed by the other practices. But we can think of a variety of examples. For example, sharing with your peers that you voted on social media, changing the filter on your Facebook photo to a rainbow to support marriage equality, or to the colors of the French flag, as we probably saw in the past week. The use of petition sites like change.org to address issues like sexual assault. The use of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, or more recently, Black on Campus, which has been trending in it, we talk about both voice and influence. Now, these examples of voice do not, in and of themselves, suggest evidence of influence over the political process, over policy, over institutions. So it's really important to bear that in mind. And actually, Danielle Allen, who's a political philosopher who is on the Research Network, has recently edited a volume called From Voice to Influence that explores that distinction. But we believe that examples of voice are important in their own right, but we're also interested in when voice becomes an opportunity for actual influence. So these are the questions we've been looking at in our good participation project. In particular, our group has been interested in civic youth who are active offline and the extent to which they're sharing evidence of that activity online. So you're active offline, but are they really taking up these opportunities for civic voice that exist online? And our first wave of interviews pointed to 3 different types of online expression amongst the civic youth we interviewed. We call these patterns blended, differentiated, and bounded. A doctoral student on our project, Emily Weinstein, published an article that lays out the nuances of these different approaches. Essentially, we found that most of the young people we interviewed adopted a blended approach, meaning that they expressed their political views or evidence of their civic activities across all the different social media networks that they were a part of. About 20% of the youth we interviewed took a more differentiated approach. They modified their political voice by audience. So they would share evidence of their politics on Twitter and Tumblr maybe, but not on Facebook. And it varied which platform, by youth, where they were political. And then about 20% or so were bounded. So even though they were civically active, they strived to keep evidence of their politics off the internet. So this is kind of interesting. They're all young civic actors. They're all really committed to these causes, but the ways in which they're exhibiting their civic activities on social media vary tremendously. So I want to pause here for a minute because I'm curious about what you think about these different patterns. And I'm also a big fan of a turn and talk. So I'm going to do a turn and talk now, and I'm going to hear to what extent you think you see yourself in one of these patterns here. So let's take about 3 minutes, turn to a neighbor, and answer the question, to what extent do you share these ideas with The bounded meant that they were using them for social purposes, but not sharing their civic or political ideas. So I hope that was clear. So let's hear from 2 people. To what extent do you see you in this framework, or is there another pattern that we didn't see among these 2? In the back.
Well, I'm bounded. But my reasons are that actually I don't see that patterns like Facebook and Twitter in particular actually have my best interests at heart. I think that if I participate, particularly by expressing political views or sharing academic work or that sort of thing, means that I'm complicit in the modification of participants. Facebook and Twitter, the first 2, definitely their profit is monetizing their participants, and I won't participate.
So you're bounding as a political act. Very nice. So how many of you bound, even if for different reasons? No politics online at all. Interesting. Another voice.
We had an interesting conversation because I try to say I've been limited because I've been on social media my entire life since social media has existed. I started with AOL Instant Messenger through Friendster and all that. But as I get older, I'm falling into different categories, and now I try to be more differentiated in my approach to politics. I think because of my public influence now that I didn't have when I was younger. And so I think over time it's changing and letting it's approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So as you become more of a public figure in a way, or become, enter professional roles, then you take on different responsibilities that complicate this landscape. How many of you would say you're differentiated online, sharing some political ideas on some platforms but not others? And how many of you are blended? You share it all across platforms. So a smaller group. Very interesting. So we were very interested in these findings among the young civic actors, and one thing we wanted to know relates to the second comment here from, what was your name? Cindy. So to what extent were these patterns going to endure over time? So these were you between the ages of 15 and 25. To what extent were these patterns stable? Likely not very stable, but we were curious to see what would happen if we went back to them. So we did. So we went back to the same participants 2 years later, and we asked them, first of all, to confirm that we got it right the first time about how they would characterize their political expression online. And for the most part, we were on target. Phew, thank goodness, because this paper was already out for publication. I think, was it? Or it was under review. And then we wanted to know to what extent what their pattern looked like at that time. And we also asked them to tell us about why any changes had occurred. And this is some of what we heard. So Gavin here, who was 18 at time 2, 16 at time, was blended at time 1, meaning she shared it all online, said, once I began applying to different universities this past year, I consciously tried to limit the amount of information about my political views on my Facebook page. The last thing I wanted is to be held back or stereotyped for my political views. So she's really pointing actually to the risks that go along with having a politicized digital footprint. I'm really concerned about the consequences for her future. But we also heard other things. So for example, Jorge, who was an active dialoguer when we first spoke to him, said this 2 years later. I began to realize that discussion in person is both more meaningful and less problematic. It's easy to feel ganged up while on the internet. It's often just a back and forth of long-winded comments that get more and more personal rather than a meaningful dialogue. So Jorge is pointing to something different. He's pointing to the potential for backlash, conflict, disagreement, and the sense that where is it going? Is this meaningful and getting anywhere with this? And this may be, familiar to many of you who've either gotten into political conversations online or just observed the comment threads on news sites. So these concerns were raised by youth across our sample when we returned to them. And in fact, whereas blended or loud voices were most common at time 1. At time 2, bounded was actually the most common pattern. So we saw a quieting effect over time, which, to a certain extent had to do with the issues that Jorge mentioned around uncivil discourse online, but to a certain extent also had to do with moving into new life stages and attending to some of the risks that go along with having a footprint that is politicized online. Now that doesn't mean that these, obviously time 2 patterns are fixed either, but we were concerned about these findings. We were concerned that this was suggesting sort of the waning of the inclination to express the civic and political voice online. So this study really surfaced a number of new research questions that we're examining now. And we're in the middle of coding our data. We went back into the field and interviewed young people, many of whom are more active online dialoguers. We actually selected for that in this study. We really are exploring now what's the content of their political exchanges. We're actually doing artifact interviews where we're getting screenshots of their political conversations, and we're looking at them alongside their interviews where they tell us how they made meaning of these conversations. We're also asking, back to this question about good versus bad approaches in citizenship, we're asking for their conceptions of what is a good model for an online political conversation look like to you, and what's a bad model. They have a lot to say on this point. We're looking closely at their dialogue moves, their tactics, and how they deal with conflict, how they both start and sustain political conversations when they get into them online, what strategies and tools they use. And the last thing is how they make meaning of these political conversations and how it affects their inclinations to do participatory politics going forward. And this last question is really a question about the implications of these online tools for their civic identities. Are they encouraging them to become active citizens, or is there a disinhibiting effect? So this is a really important question. So because we're coding data now, my colleagues would be very displeased with me if I shared any specific findings. But one thing I can say is that youth are using a variety of really interesting, innovative moves and strategies. So they seem very savvy. They are very savvy. However, they're also telling us that they need more support, specifically for negotiating difficult political conversations online, where the conversation gets heated and even hostile and off-point, and how to get things back on track. So if I return to my online questions again, I have a couple things to add to this slide. So, what does good online participation, specifically political dialogue, look like? I'll have certainly more to say once the current study is complete, but I can say that respectful speech is key here, given the indications that some youth are withdrawing from political conversations because of incivility. The second thing I'll say is that meaningful is really important, as Jorge pointed out. Youth aren't going to stay in conversations if they don't feel like they're getting anywhere, learning something new, deepening their perspectives, or being able to share their ideas in productive ways. What does it require? It certainly requires digital literacies, but also those skills to navigate difficult conversations, something that's coming up. And a disposition, an inclination or motivation to stay in these conversations and weather some of the challenges of being in an online context where tone is hard to discern, where one's words can be copied and pasted and shared with the broader audience. The willingness to stay with it and weather some of those obstacles and challenges. And so how might we support it? So the YPP network has created a couple of different action groups. One action group is focused on educating for participatory politics, and so we've been developing classroom materials that are for mainly the little bit beyond, looking at how we can broaden young people who aren't civic actors, who aren't using social media for civic purposes, their conceptions of how they can use these media, but also making them aware of some of the challenges and equipping them with some strategies and tools for navigating those difficult situations. And I fully expect that what we find in this latest round of interviews will really inform those curriculum videos, some of those moves, tactics, and strategies that we're seeing among youth. So now I want to turn to the latest front of my work that relates to these questions, and it's a project that brings me into new territory for a couple of reasons. One is that it brings me into the territory of intercultural exchange, but another is that it also is about the design of an online community that is in part for this purpose, getting youth who are from different cultural contexts to talk with one another about meaningful issues. So this project is, okay, well, we're in the middle box for a moment. We situate this project in terms of two important challenges. One is the challenge of moving really quickly, and the fact that all of us, but I think particularly youth, move very quickly on social media and may tend toward more superficial social media encounters. The civic youth notwithstanding, I'm talking about, and this is a lot of what we saw in the work that we did on the curriculum project, this tendency to move very quickly and not necessarily reflect on the substance of one's social media encounters. And the other thing, which if you can see it, this is the cover of Eden's Women's Book Rewire, is the tendency for us to end up in networks with like-minded people online. You know, despite the promise of the internet, which would bring us digital cosmopolitanism, and despite our good intentions, we often end up in networks with people who think, look, and come from the same places that we come from. So the tendency to flock together. So given this, the big question that situates this work is, can we leverage social media in ways that promotes good intercultural exchange? And we're not the only ones asking this question, of course. So there are several global education initiatives who've been involved in this space for a while. So just a few examples, iNearn have been really pioneers in matching up classrooms of youth from across the globe. Global Nomads tries to bring students from different cultures together. A classroom in Texas is grouped with a classroom in Afghanistan, and they go through a curriculum together. Space to Create brings youth together from different cultures, and they get involved in creative activities. So, and there's a lot of energy around this in the global education space. And the work that we're doing, which is now a project called How to Teach and Learn, shares similar premises with those projects. We try to bring young people together, youth who are from different cultures. We've created a private, pseudonymous, online setting. The emphasis is on exchanging stories and perspectives. But I think one thing that is unique about our project is this emphasis on slow observing and slow listening activities. This is a project that I co-direct with Shari Tishman, a researcher at Project Zero, and Liz Dawes-Rising, also at Project Zero. And Shari in particular has a long-standing interest and expertise in the area of slow looking. So I just want to share a quote from Shari that really points to what we're trying to cultivate in this space. Slow looking means taking the time to carefully observe more than meets the eye at first glance. It implies lingering, looking long, being generous, almost lavish with one's attentional focus in order to see beyond first impressions and to uncover the complexity of things. It's a beautiful way of putting it. So the work of the How to Teach and Learn project builds on this interest of Shari's, but it also is strengthened by our partnership with a journalist who's carrying out a project called Walk is the project of journalist Paul Sargent, who is doing, he started out doing a 7-year walk around the globe. To be honest, I think it's going to be more like 8 or 9 at this point. This map shows this intended route. He set off from the Rift Valley in Ethiopia in January 2013. So he set off from an area rich in hominid fossils. And he is roughly retracing the migratory pathways of our ancestors out of Africa and across the globe. Of course, he's skipping Europe and Australia. Those of you from Europe, I feel kind of offended by that. But Paul's project is a radical exercise in slow journalism. And it was really born out of his frustration. He was a foreign correspondent for many years. And he became extremely frustrated with jetting in and out of assignments. Moving in and out of stories too quickly, as Paul argues. When we move too quickly, we miss the hidden stories that really render meaning. So slow journalism allows me to make hidden connections that you miss when you travel too quickly. So the work of Paul is really, Paul, when he was planning this walk, was at the Keynote Center at Harvard, and he reached out to us because he was looking for educational partners. We're one partner along with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting in developing educational materials that connect in some way with the ideas of Paul's walk on slow journalism. The other premise of Paul's walk is about our information age. He often talks about how we are overloaded with information, something that many of you think about, I'm sure, a lot, and we're almost assaulted by it, but we'll be lacking meaning. So he sees this project, this effort to slow down as a way to recapture meaning. And it may be a perfect example of what Eric was talking about this morning as a meaningful inefficiency. There's nothing more inefficient than walking across the globe. There are plenty of other mechanisms for getting from A to B, but I think it could qualify as a prime example. So Paul models his slow journalism, slow listening and storytelling through his milestones, which are multimedia portraits of individuals he meets on his walks. He also shares his stories in slightly longer form in his dispatches, which are published on National Geographic. This is one about a family who met in a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. So in keeping with what Paul is doing, in building on some of the long-standing work at Project Zero on thinking routines and slow looking and global confidence, we created a program that has these learning goals, getting youth to slow down, to observe the world carefully, and to listen attentively to others. Opportunities to exchange stories and perspectives about people, place, and identity, and to reflect on how their own lives connect to the lives of other young people, but also to larger human stories, larger global stories. So these are the big goals that really define our work on how we learn. And to get a little bit more specific about our curriculum, we do have young people doing activities, some of which mirror the things that Paul's doing in his walk quite directly, taking a slow neighborhood walk, trying to see the familiar with unfamiliar eyes, interviewing a neighbor and listening to their story about how the community has changed over time. We have a second learning journey that is more key to looking at local and global connections. But this first learning journey really sets the stage for some of those goals around slowing down. And to give you a little bit of insight, more particular insight into what we did, I'm going to share a video with my colleague describing our neighborhood walk activity and showing some student work. She would love that screenshot.
Welcome to the activity portion of Step 3, taking neighborhood walks. Now it's time for you to do a walk of your own, though one that is a lot shorter than Paul's. Students have told us that they are surprised by what they notice when they slow down to look with fresh eyes at where they live. Plan to take a walk in your neighborhood or local area. It may include places on your sketch map. You can walk by yourself or with a classmate, friend, or family member. As you walk in your neighborhood or local area, take photos of things that catch your attention. What do you see, feel, hear, taste, or smell? Try to look at the place and the people who live or work there with fresh eyes. Here are some ideas for different kinds of photos you can take. Photos that capture a whole neighborhood scene, and photos that zoom in on the detail you find interesting. Photos where you're pointing the camera up, and photos where you're pointing the camera toward the ground. Photos of things that are common or familiar in your neighborhood, and photos of things that might be unexpected or surprising. Something special that you'd like to share. Post 2 photos that you took on your walk. Tell the story of why you took these 2 photos and why you chose to post them. What do you like about the photos you took? What would you like other people in your walking party to notice or understand about them? How, if at all, did taking a walk and or taking these photos make you think in new or different ways about your neighborhood or local area? Enjoy walking.
So, I mean, the work that youth are creating in this platform is beautiful. We display more of it on our Instagram account. But what's exciting is to see how, and to hear from youth when we do surveys and interviews with them about how these little snapshots into other young people's lives really are meaningful to them. However, we do have a challenge in our community, and so I want to kind of circle back to this issue of good online participation. And our goal of this platform is not just to get youth to slow down and observe the world around them, but also to slow down and look at the lives of other young people and listen attentively to the lives that other and perspectives that other young people have and engage with them in meaningful ways. And so in the first year of our, or so of doing this program, I think we just kind of figured we'd put the kids, in these international groups on our platform. They're grouped, I can say this before, but they're grouped in these international smaller learning groups, 5 or 6 classrooms in different parts of the world. Similar age, but different geographically, also socioeconomically. And we thought, well, we'll put them on this platform, we'll give them this interesting, rich curriculum. We think it's rich and interesting. And give them the opportunity to comment on one another's work, and it'll just be magical. But, kind of naive. So that while we did see some really deep and meaningful exchanges, a lot of what we saw was this, which is great, it's really cool, right? But that's as far as it goes. And so our challenge was in dialogue, like how do we get the exchanges to go somewhere deeper? How can we see something more meaningful and substantive? How do we really get you to exchange their perspectives and the meaningful aspects of their lives? So what we did is we constructed, in collaboration with Chris Sloan, who's a National Writing Project educator and a co-founder of Youth Voices, we developed an intervention called the Dialogue Toolkit. And the toolkit is basically a set of moves that we suggest young people in our platform make when they go to comment on one another's work. Moves like notice. What stands out to you, catches your eye in this person's post or photo? Be specific. So what do you notice in particular? Smith, cut a phrase or a sentence, cut and paste a phrase or a sentence from the original post into the comment box and say something about it. What do you find interesting about it? What strikes you about what is being said here? Extend. Describe how this perspective really extended your thoughts in new directions. What does it suggest to you? And so our design approach was really, it was kind of gentle actually. We have those icons that represent the different moves that we've chosen. But they're just nudges. When you mouse over each icon, you just get a reminder of what the move is. And in the curriculum, for certain activities that they do, we suggest that they use particular moves. But it's relatively open-ended. Now, anecdotally, I think that we think we're seeing some kind of impact from these moves. If you look at the third comment, you actually see the student sort of taking them on in kind of an automated way. It's not necessarily what you're going for, but still really thinking about the comments. I noticed that, snipping something that was of interest, and maybe doing a bit of an extend move here. But our systematic research is still to be done, and the agenda or the questions that we have are, first of all, what are youth actually gaining when the dialogue does go to the extent we'd like to see it go to, where it's a meaningful or more substantive change in perspectives. What are they gaining from that? What are they taking away? Does the dialogue toolkit matter? And when, where, for whom does it matter? What's the role of the educator, the teacher? We know that some teachers spend a lot of time emphasizing the toolkit and sort of modeling the slow listening and sort of attention to mindful commenting that we're trying to promote here, and others don't. And I'm particularly interested in the transfer potential, but that might be a dream to think that something like this might transfer over to more mindful commenting on other platforms. Is something that is of great interest to me. So if I, one last time, go back to my big through-line questions, I think this work has given new insight to these questions. It really, the Out of Eden Learn work really does place an even stronger emphasis, I think, on the meaningful part of exchanges and good online participation. And on Out of Eden Learn, and arguably in political conversations too, I think the sweet spot is between respectful and meaningful. It's where the two converge together. And so we're trying to model that and support that specifically in Out of Eden Learn, and we'll see how it goes. Now, what does it require? Now, I didn't touch on this explicitly, but we are trying to scaffold particular global competence skills in this intercultural online learning program, drawing on Veronica Boyce-Mencia's framework of global competence, which really takes seriously the importance of recognizing one's own perspectives, including one's cultural biases and assumptions and privileges, as well as taking the perspectives of others. And so that dispositional element, the disposition to be curious about other cultures, but also sensitive and have cultural humility, is something we're really trying to promote. We think is important for this. And how might we support it? And so we see a lot of power in just the idea of slowing down, slow looking, active and visible listening, which is what we're trying to model in the commenting, mindful commenting. And this connects with other work on mindfulness online, like Howard Reingold, work on contemplative computing, so there are connections out there to what we're trying to do. So to wrap up, these are big questions that I've been exploring for a long time on a couple of different fronts. And not that I have definitive answers, but I feel like with every piece of work I'm doing, I'm moving in the direction of where answers may lie, but also new questions surface all the time. And, as I said at the beginning, we have not taken a very explicit media literacies approach to these different projects, but I know that there are connections there to be made, and I'm curious to hear the connections in your minds. Thank you so much.
I was very interested in the presentation. I really appreciated how you moved from the digital to the physical, because as you were talking, I was thinking about, I work in media Gladwell piece, the Revolution Climate tweeted, was making the argument that the online civic energy does not translate to meaningful action, citing the Greensboro sit-ins, which required people to physically sit in, suggesting that there might not be motivation there. So I'm worried about paying attention and then actual motivation afterwards.
So let me address the second question first, on the Malcolm Gladwell piece that the network often grapples with, the slacktivism critique, essentially. Like, well, I mean, I think over time there is more work that's actually looking at the impact of online political activism and its connection to offline, and showing that there actually is a connection. It's not that, I think that some of the data is showing that youth aren't just clicking like on an article that has a political point of view and feel like they've done with their citizenship. If anything, the Black Lives Matter movement has showed those strong connections between posting on social media and getting out in the streets and protesting. The other thing I'll say about that is Jennifer Earle, who's a sociologist who's part of the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network, often says, well, people have this critique of online activism, but the reality is, if you look at different forms of protest offline, we don't know a lot about the outcomes of those forms of protest. You'll run into some kind of, some kind of rally, a small rally of a couple of individuals, and who's to say that that's more effective than clicking something online? And so, we need to also look at that dimension of this. So going back to your initial question, which was on meaning and political conversations offline versus online, I think for some youth, they're finding that they can't get meaning through the online space. And we're seeing in this most recent study, some of you who were active dialoguers in the past, moving away from that because feeling like some of the issues and concerns that come up, some of the inability to read one another gets in the way of them finding meaning and making progress in understanding other people's perspectives. Others are developing some good strategies, actually, for pushing beyond that. Strategies for countering the lack of tone, using particular moves like provoking and questioning in civil ways to try to pull out other people's perspectives. So, we're seeing, it's too soon to say because we're still coding our data, but I think we're seeing different things emerging in the city. Yes.
So I noticed, and this is kind of about methodology and sort of the ephemeral nature of studying social media, the bounded and the social media platforms that you showed us that missing there were Snapchat and Instagram, right, which are now, and just in talking with my students, what they use the most. And those are very distinctive from the other platforms that you've been looking at. So how do you deal with that as a researcher? Because Snapchat is at a completely different place for them, and as is Instagram, and they both have their own complications and places where pitfalls, etc., and things that benefit them, right? So how do you, as a researcher, how do you keep up with all of these as they come along, and as young people tend to be the first ones to sort of go to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult as a researcher, but I mean, if you continue to get funding to continue to do your work, you can stay on top of what you are using. I can say that in this recent study with the dialoguers, which we just conducted over the past 6 months or so, we expected that Facebook would not really be alive but it is the most common platform these days. And this isn't a survey study, it's a deep qualitative study with a relatively small group of youth, but Facebook was the go-to platform for all of these youth for a variety of reasons, because of particular affordances of Facebook. Number one, being able, the perception at least, that they could control their audiences on Facebook better than on Twitter, for example, and having negative experiences on platforms that were a little bit more open. So it is difficult as a researcher, but I can say it's even more difficult in the work on educating for participatory politics. If we think about creating materials for teachers to help talk with youth about some of the particular situations that they confront, some of it varies quite a lot by platform, and some teachers may be behind the curve in terms of keeping up with platforms, and we can create materials that mention certain Snapchat and Twitter and Facebook, but in 5 years' time, will they still be perceived as relevant? It's very tricky. I'm curious about how other people who are researching this space and creating media literacy materials around this space are confronting that challenge.
So we have time for one more question.
Are there any cultural preferences for different platforms? In other words, are certain cultural groups using, let's say, Tumblr versus other cultural groups using Twitter? I imagine that some social groups prefer others over just because that's what people are using, but I really don't know much about that.
Because our work is qualitative and we have very small, we're not looking at differences across different cultural, racial, ethnic groups. That is work that survey researchers, are surfacing some of those patterns. And Joe Kahn and Kathy Cohen, who lead the survey portion of our study, may have more to say about that, not necessarily on the platform, but around like the inclination to use social media for political purposes, where they found that many African American and Latino youth are more likely, for example, to use social media to make a political statement than other youth. That's definitely in the realm of national or cross-national survey research more than our small qualitative studies. So I want to thank you all, and if you have other questions, I will ask them.
Just before you guys go, there's